Did parents in the Middle Ages really look at their children and see only small, unfinished adults? In this piece from 23 July 2026, Works in Progress enters the nurseries and schoolrooms of the Middle Ages to challenge a cold assumption. The popular idea that medieval parents were indifferent to their children because of high mortality rates falls apart when held up to the actual records. Letters and schoolbooks point elsewhere, to mothers playing hide-and-seek and fathers paying for apprenticeships. The people of 500 years ago were not a different species of human. They were simply parents trying to keep their children safe in a much harder world. Written by Samuel Hughes in Works in Progress, narrated for ARFA. The myth of medieval childhood. Is it really plausible that children survived the hardship of medieval life without devoted parents? Growing up, I acquired a vague idea that medieval people did not view childhood as we do. I was told they saw children merely as defective or incomplete adults, and that they did not love their children as we love ours, perhaps as a way of coping with high infant mortality. As I grew older, I came to associate this idea with the name of Philippe Aurier, a French historian who argued in the 1960s that medieval childhood was profoundly remote in these ways. Aurier's work never attained complete acceptance in academia, but it was vastly influential on the wider public. As it turns out, however, Aurier's view is just not true. This has been established beyond doubt by a wealth of later scholarship across Europe. Nicholas Orme's Medieval Children is the leading study for England in particular. It cannot be overemphasized that there is nothing to be said for Aurier's view, Orme notes. It is mistaken not simply in detail, but in substance. It is time to lay it to rest. It is sometimes imagined that medieval people had a great many children. This was not generally the case. Very large families occasionally occurred, but most medieval people only had 3 or 4 children, somewhat more among the rich and somewhat fewer among the very poor. At least in England, this was partly because they married quite late, generally in their mid or late 20s. About 25% of children died in their first year, and another 15% by their 10th. The median English child thus grew up in a home with 1 sibling and 2 parents in their 30s or 40s, being in this respect just like the median English child today.
Surviving grandparents often lived nearby, but rarely under the same roof. Abortion was considered sinful, but the situation was more complicated than might be supposed. Medieval people did not think that early-term fetuses had souls, believing them to be alive but unconscious, like vegetables. Early-term abortion was thus not considered homicide and was not punishable at common law, though a church court might impose a penance like regular fasting or almsgiving. Late-term abortion was thought to be a kind of homicide, but was not normally punished at common law either. This distinction persisted until the 19th century. Medieval parents made immense sacrifices for their children and seem to have expected little in return. Feeding a child consumed about 15% of average income, and parents often continued to support children throughout their adulthood. Older children often performed light work at home, but at just the age they might become a net economic asset, 13 or 14, they were usually sent away to acquire skills and savings through apprenticeship or working in service. They may have remitted some of this income to their parents, but this was not standard, and in fact, parents generally paid for their children's apprenticeships. Grateful children sometimes supported their parents in old age, but again, this does not seem to have been the norm. Medieval England was often at war, and the government was desperately in need of soldiers. The Crown repeatedly issued decrees banning dishonest and useless ball games, like football, requiring boys over the age of 7 to practice archery instead. Needless to say, English boys could not be stopped from playing football, and the decrees were widely ignored.
Child mortality was high, but there is no reason to think that parents were indifferent to it. Few diaries or letters survive in which they expressed their grief, but it was sometimes recorded by others. The 5th child of Henry III and Eleanor of Provence was called Catherine. Catherine was born disabled and never learned to speak, and she died when she was 3 years old. Both her parents were heartbroken. The chronicler Matthew Paris wrote that Queen Eleanor fell sick with grief and could find no relief in medicine nor human consolation. Parents also took joy in their children, and vice versa. An Oxford schoolbook of the 1490s describes a schoolboy returning home for the holidays. Upon meeting his parents, "We wept for joy,
each to other. The 13th century treatise, Ancrene Wissa, imagined Jesus playing with a Christian believer as a mother does with her child. She runs away from him and hides herself, and lets him sit alone and look anxiously around and call, "Dame, dame," and weep a while. Then she jumps out laughing with outstretched arms and embraces and kisses him and wipes his eyes. The medieval people who emerge from Orm's book are quite unlike the strange and cold figures that we have been led to imagine. I believe they were ourselves, 500 or 1,000 years ago, Orm writes. Perhaps we should ask why the Ariès hypothesis ever exercised such a hold over the popular imagination. Was it ever really plausible that children survived the terrible hardship of medieval life without devoted parents? Next time a scholar makes exciting claims about how some class of human beings is incomprehensibly unlike us, we would do well to ask similar questions.